So this covers all the aspects I've mentioned before with the notes I put on the slides down here. Okay. So yeah, basically everything condensed into a Google Docs page. So with that being said, we can start filling this in. So anyone can answer. I don't really want to call people since it's our first class, but who is a speaker of this? It should be pretty easy. Feel free to unmute and speak or just type it in the chat. No.
Wait, is it like George W. Bush or something?
Yeah, George W. Bush, basically. Do you guys know who he is, or are you guys not sure? It's
I'm
okay
not
for
that
not sure.
familiar with him.
Okay, yeah, exactly, because you guys are all young. Okay, so yeah, the speaker is George W. Bush. So, and then he was the American president during the 9/11 terrorist attack. So we can say he was the, I guess, concurrent US president. Or just like the US president then. I guess you can say the then US president. That might be better. He is the then US president. So that's what we want to note down. We don't really have to write down, for example, how this impact, like does this have a particular meaning of who wrote it and who said it, because that's going to be something we break down later. But yeah, okay. What's the purpose of the speech? What do you guys think the purpose is of the speech? Your purpose is just like why he is making the speech about 9/11, the 9/11 terrorist attack, right? So why do you guys think he's doing this? Any ideas? I mean, it could just be something you read from the, yeah.
I think he might just be like settling people down, because when the terrorists like came, like I'm sure that everyone would be like panicking, and he's just like
so
trying to
that's
tell
definitely one
everyone
purpose.
that he's like gonna like do something about it.
Yeah, so that's definitely one purpose, right? Settling people down. So you're like calming them, you're saying like it's okay. Despite the terrorist attack, everything's going to be okay. Yeah. So that's definitely one of the purpose. Can anyone else think of another purpose? Let's say, Sean and Eva, do you guys have ideas on this?
Is it maybe like to like call for action, like to like let people?
It could be a call to action, definitely. But what do you think the call to action would be? Like? Be a little bit more specific on that. So, if you think there's a call to action, what do you think the call to action is?
Like to stay together, or like.
Yeah, stay together. Okay, yeah. Don't point fingers. Stay together. That could be one. Sorry. Call to action. Stay united, I guess. Okay, and Sean, do you have an idea or not really?
I gotta say, well, it could be like telling terrorists that their plan has failed.
Yeah, sure. Telling the terrorists that their plan has failed. Okay, so these are all like the possible purposes I were tentatively writing down. Now, who do you guys think the audience is, Serena?
The people of the United States and possibly the terrorists.
States and we can just say terrorists as well. Okay, and this is an open question, so does anyone know the context behind this? I mean, the speech round gives you a little bit of context, but does anyone know specifically the context?
Like, I think the terrorists like crashed planes into like the building.
Yeah, exactly. So it was a 9/11 terrorist attack, right? So it's a 9/11 terrorist attack, basically where terrorists hijacked Also hijacked a plane, 2 planes, and crashed it into the World Trade Center. It's like the Twin Tower at the time, right? So it's the World Trade Center, the 2 towers of the United States. Okay. So in this case, in this speech is rather straightforward. Remember, exigence is just the reason behind why we are kind of making this, why we're saying something like this. So the exigence in this case is just kind of like the context carried over, because it's the next day following the terrorist attack, or the terrorist attack happened in the morning. So the presidential address is that, right? So it's some in this, it doesn't have to be the same, but in this speech it is the same. Okay. Now this will be a little bit more analytical when it comes to the bottom 3 boxes. The top is rather easy to fill in, right? If the bottom 3 is a bit harder. So does anyone have any idea on what are some of the choices George W. Bush used throughout his speech? Anyone have any idea on this? Or are you guys not sure what you guys are looking, what we should be looking for, basically?
Yeah, I'm not sure what we're like looking for. So.
Okay, wait, okay, then give me 1 second. Let me basically, yeah, okay, so let me go through this. Let me just go through the entire speech, and then this will be like a quick example. So let me read through the speech and then tell you guys kind of what to analyze, okay? So let's start with the very first paragraph, right? Good evening. Today, our fellow citizens, our way of life, our very freedom came under attack in a series of deliberate and deadly terrorist attacks. Okay, so when and then the victims were in airplanes or in their offices, secretary, businessmen, women, military, federal workers, moms and dads, friends and neighbors. Thousands of lives were suddenly ended by evil, despicable acts of terror. Pictures of planes flying into buildings, fire, burning, huge structures collapsing have filled us with disbelief, terrible sadness, and a quiet and yielding anger. These acts of mass murder were intended to frighten our nation into chaos and retreat, but that failed. Our country is strong. So just reading this first paragraph alone, you can tell that George W. Bush used a lot of specific choices to achieve basically the purpose that he has mentioned, or that we have put down here, right? So for example, even in his first sentence, you can tell that he uses specific diction. He uses really strong words. But if you read the speech, you know, he uses very poignant and strong word, like targeted language, basically, to achieve this purpose. So reading this, you can see first a repetition, right? Repetition is a thing where you repeat like a choice, repeat like a statement over and over again to create kind of a rhythm, a rhythmic feel to your speech. So he starts off with our, and our, right? So our fellow citizens, our way of life, and our freedom kind of builds up to this like crescendo, basically, of like just how big the event is. Right? So you have 3 hours here, which we could characterize as repetition. Okay, came under attack in a series of deliberate and deadly. So, you know, in some senses, alliteration, right? Alliteration is when you use words that start with the same letter over and over again to create a feel. However, more specific, aside from just alliteration though, the specific diction on this also is like noteworthy, right? So deliberate and deadly. Deliberate meaning, of course, it's a terrorist attack and it is deliberate, but saying that it's deliberate instead of just saying, think of this sentence without the word deliberate, right? So in a series of deadly terrorist attacks, it doesn't carry quite the same way as deliberate because it puts the blame directly on the terrorists who carried out these attacks, creating a us and them perspective. So just within the first sentence, you can see how he uses our, the collective pronoun our, to group the United States people together. We came under attack, right? Us, the fellow citizens, together as a group, our way of life and our freedom has been jeopardized by them, the terrorists, and they're doing this deliberately and in a deadly fashion. Okay? So the specific diction that George W. Bush uses just within the first sentence already create, although it doesn't seem like much, right? Because when you're reading this, you're just reading this naturally and you're processing the speech as it is. However, if you want to analyze the speech more in depth to understand what makes good like a great compelling speaker, this is the thing that we want to do. Okay. So just right now, is anyone like really confused, or am I kind of making sense? If I'm like, if you guys are confused, just feel free to like tell me. Because I could go back and re-explain it, because it's going to be a little bit more. I'm only gonna say more basically from here on out. So if you're confused now, do bring it up. Okay.
Okay, I'm not confused. I can understand you.
Wait, sorry, what do you say?
Yeah, I can understand you.
When it comes to what?
No, I can.
Oh, you can. Oh, okay. I thought you said you can't. Okay. So, anyone else, like Serena, Sean, Eva, are we all fine with whatever I've said so far? Yeah. Okay. So good. So basically, within the first sentence, we can kind of, we can kind of understand what is going on, right? Then we move on to the second sentence. The victims were in airplanes or in their offices, secretaries, businessmen, women, military, federal workers, moms and dads, friends, and neighbors. Now, it doesn't seem like much again, but the second sentence also carries some choices that we want to analyze. For example, the victims were, you can see how when listing out the casualties, George W. Bush goes from like the top of the table to commoners, right? So remember the building that was hit is the Twin Tower. So a lot of like economic and political activities were going on there. It's a huge office basically. So you normally think of it as like richer, I guess, people are there. So secretaries, of course, on the top, right? Influential people, secretaries, businessmen, right? However, then he goes down to more commoners. So he goes to women, for example, which is a big category, military and federal workers, mom and dads, friends and neighbors. So it goes from what we see is it goes from a degree of like kind of anonymity. So you don't really know who these are, right? Like secretaries, some abstract secretaries, some abstract businessmen, women as a really huge category, military and federal workers. Once again, it's not really that person, right? However, the transition goes from basically on top, like influential people to commoners, people around us, also goes from unfamiliar to familiar, right? So moms and dads, friends and neighbors, people we're undoubtedly more familiar with than the secretaries and businessmen that he mentioned earlier on. So this way of basically characterizing his, kind of listing out the casualties and the people that are affected brings a sense of connection to everyone, right? So what we see is we know the 9/11 attack happened in New York City, happened in Manhattan. So, but his address is to the entire nation, right? So he by basically making the statement out like this draws everyone together, like everyone by virtue of just existing and as a part of the United States citizen, the R group that he created earlier. By doing this, he groups you together and then say that, oh yeah, even though you might not be directly affected, we, by some shape or form, are connected because of our nation, right? Moving on, thousands of lives are suddenly ended by an evil, despicable acts of terror. So the words here are really strong, right? Evil, despicable, acts of terror, thousands of lives. So these are just really strong words that really put into perspective what the terrorists have accomplished, or not accomplished, it's not accomplishment, but the terrorists have like enacted. Right? So pictures of airplanes flying into buildings, fires burning, huge structure collapsing have filled us with disbelief, terrible sadness, and a quiet and yielding anger. So here what he's doing is he's stating out directly what the people ought to be feeling, right? So it's almost weird, right? So he is, when something traumatic, let's say when something really bad happens, what are some ways that you guys will go about doing? Let's say today your sister got hurt, right? Or like your friend got hurt. How will you comfort your friend? So okay, let's say today I did really bad on the test, right? I did really bad on the test. And then you're trying to comfort me. What are some ways that you want to comfort your friend by failing when they fail a test? Let's say Serena, do you have an idea? Anything works.
Then
Yeah. Wait, what? Sorry, what did you say?
reassure them that it's just one test and it's not that much and it's gonna be okay.
Yeah, so you can assure them that it's one test and it's gonna be okay. That's definitely a good way of doing it, right? So the thing that I guess the point I'm trying to make here is you can either, you know, what another way to comfort your friend might be that's equally as effective might be taking them out for ice cream, right? And then let them, I just say they really like ice cream, and then they'll just forget about the test, at least for right now. Right? Not saying it's a good way, but it's definitely another way you can kind of comfort your friend. So the thing about this is the approach, I guess, George W. Bush decides to take is to relive what just happened, right? He characterizes again what just happened. So planes flying to buildings collapsing. These are traumatic experiences, at least for many people. And he's saying that again because he chooses to say that again and not ignore the issue because he believes that ignoring the issue is not a way to progress further, right? So there's the explicit choice here in mentioning basically why the building is like mentioning the attack again, like summarizing the attacks again. And what this also ensures is that if you're somehow not caught up with the news, you at least know what happened. Right? Which I think is hard to not know this, at least for people who are in the who are like existing then. Of course, it's a very big thing. However, yeah, it catches everyone up basically and summarizes everything, and then it also fuels this unyielding anger and terrible sadness. It acts like ammunition basically for all the emotions that he mentioned later again. So by bringing up the attacks, like by kind of like recharacterizing the attacks again, once again, he ushers this feeling of disbelief, this terrible sadness, and the anger that he subsequently talks about. Right? And notice how later on, the next sentence, these acts of mass murder were intended to frighten our nation into chaos and retreat, but they have failed. Our country is strong. So notice how once again, addiction here is very, very strong. So when you read this, remember how you mentioned it's a terrorist attack earlier on, right? Which it is a terrorist attack. That's the definition of a terrorist attack, right? However, here, instead of saying it's a terrorist attack again, he says these acts of mass murder, right? So mass murder is not like mass murder. When you think about like mass murder, you think about like, for example, World War II and like basically the genocidal like acts of the Nazis, right? Or something like mass murder. Basically, murder's word has a really negative connotation. It basically entails a one-sided slaughter. And although this is technically what the attack is, by characterizing as mass murder, he paints a picture in a much stronger manner than if you just said like, these condemnable acts by the terrorists, right? That feels very abstract. Right? If today Bush says, oh, these terrorist attacks, like, yeah, like there are terrorist attacks, and he does do that earlier, but he also used deliberate and deadly to modify, right? But now by characterizing it as murder, he points it out as what it really is, like just like a one-sided slaughter of innocent people. So you see how within the first paragraph, we have a lot to analyze already. So there's a lot, and that's the whole point of a rhetorical analysis. I'll go through, of course, most of the speech, and it won't be as much depth as the first paragraph, just because the first paragraph sets up a lot of what's to come next. But that is kind of what we want to do with rhetorical analysis, right? We want to understand, basically fill in the information of what we know. So everything here we kind of know, right? Or we could know from reading the speech. And then for the choices, appeals, and tone, we kind of want to bring up that again. For example, the choices I mentioned very quickly, diction, specific diction, like really strong word choices, right? So for example, if you read this first paragraph, you can undoubtedly see strong word choices are things like murder, deliberate and deadly, despicable acts of terror. So if later on in the speech, you also find other examples of strong word choices, then suddenly this becomes a repeating theme, right? Okay, so President Bush consistently uses really strong word choices to demonstrate his point. So in that case, you can write it down here as word choice. Or for example, if earlier on I mentioned we have the collective pronoun, right? Like the repetition of our to create an in group and an out group. If he continues this rhetoric and continues this device, you can definitely write about it. You can say President Bush uses the collective pronoun. Collective pronoun is when we say we and our. That's collective pronoun, right? So why does President Bush, and he use also a choice might be he uses the collective pronoun, and then you want to analyze, for example, how that all contributes to the purpose. Right? So what we want to do is we want to fill in the bottom 3 boxes: the choices, appeal, and tone. I want to say how these things lead to the purpose. So how does creating an in-group and out-group make people feel more assured or stay united, which might seem obvious? Or how does using the strong diction that he decided to use call out the terrorists or settle people down? Right? These are all things that we want to analyze basically in the rhetorical analysis. So moving on, let's go on to the second paragraph. Great people have been moved to defend a great nation. Terrorist attacks can shake the foundations of our biggest buildings, but they cannot touch the foundation of America. These acts shatter steel, but they cannot dent the steel of American resolve. So within here, we kind of see something that's a little bit more interesting, right? We see a bit of like repetition. I wouldn't characterize this as repetition, but it's kind of repetition in the sense that these 2 sentences follow a similar structure, right? So, and also, so if you read into these sentences, they follow a basic premise, okay? So terrorist attacks can shake the foundation of our biggest building. So what's the foundation of a building? Like when you think of a foundation of a building, you think of the land the building is built on, right? Like physical property, right? So like steel beams, the nails that put the buildings together. These are physical foundation, but they cannot touch the foundation of America. But so does anyone want to tell me, like, for example, what the foundation of America is? Like foundation of America, when you hear the word foundation of America, you're not thinking of something physical. You're thinking of something more up here, like the notion. For example, America, land of the free, right? America, where dreams come true, stuff like that. The foundation of America is very much an ideal. So it juxtaposes, or in that case, just compare, fancy word for compare. It compares well with what he talked about, the physical foundations that Bush just talked about, right? So these terrorist attacks shake the physical foundation of America, but cannot eradicate American ideals and what the values that America stands for. Subsequently, these acts shatter steel, but they cannot dent the steel of American resolve. So they shatter the steel, the physical steel of the buildings, yet cannot dent the strong fortitude of the American mind, of the American people, right? So here you can see there's a juxtaposition. You're comparing the physical damages with the emotional well-being, or I guess, yeah, the emotional slash like, what is it, like the philosophical, I guess, notion of America. So what this is saying is, so instead of saying this, what's like a really boring way to put this? A really boring way to put this might be, oh, yes, the characters, you guys have hurt us physically, but we're still fine. Like mentally, we're fine, or we're gonna be stronger. But that sounds really bad, right? Or it doesn't sound bad, but it doesn't have the same impact as Bush when he brings up these comparisons, right? So yeah, instead of just saying that, oh yeah, we're physically hurt, but we're like mentally fine, or mentally actually stronger than before. He mentions he puts it in terms of fancier. I guess he coins it in a more interesting way, in a more appealing way. So yeah, so that's it for these 2 sentences. Now that we move on, America was targeted for attack because we're the brightest beacon for freedom and opportunity in the world, and no one will keep that light from shining. So once again here, there's 2 ways you can interpret this. Right? You can say, oh, he could have said like, oh, they attacked us because we're not vulnerable and we're gonna be stronger. But that implies that we're vulnerable to begin with, right? And that's not necessarily what he wants to do. Instead, he mentions that we're attacked because we're strong. Like it's because they want to see us fall down, and that's the opposite of what we want to do, right? We'll keep going on. We'll keep on going. From his word, we're the brightest beacon And despite what happens, we'll keep no one will keep that light from continuing to shine. So it's definitely, again, this, you can say this is like a metaphor, right? This is like an example, whatever you want to characterize it as. There's a lot of things to characterize what Bush is saying. Okay. Tonight, our nation saw evil, the very worst of human nature, and we responded with the very best of America. Once again, juxtaposition, right? Or comparison. So we see the comparison of physical and mental. Now we see the comparison between good and evil, right? So we see that, like, in response to evil, we bring the best of America. Now, I don't think you guys will know this because, I mean, I wasn't born then, so I don't think you guys were born then. Okay, yeah, okay. There's no way you guys were born then too, right? But then, basically, when he means the really best of the best of America, what he meant was that at least at that during the day of the attack, America became super united. So you'll see like people, common civilians, going down to like the burning building and trying to help. Right? You'll see people donating to or assisting like the people who survived the attack. You'll see people like caring for them, talking to them, and trying to make them feel better. So that's what he meant by the very best of America. You know, when met by hardship, America doesn't respond with violence, once again, because you don't know. It's not an act of war, right? An act of war is between two countries. Yeah, a terrorist attack is done by like more of like an anonymous organization that just you cannot really target. So instead of like focusing on instead of being mad or being sad, people try to lift each other up. And that's what he meant by the very best. With the daring of our rescue workers and the caring of strangers and neighbors who came to give blood and help in any way they could. So he mentions how America basically responds to the evil and characterizes it in a really good way. Right? Instead of saying, oh, we're all people that help each other, he goes for like a more personal approach, right? The daring rescue of our workers and the caring for strangers and neighbors. So for both people who are unfamiliar and people who are familiar with alike, we treat them equally and we try to help them because fundamentally at the end of the day, we're all American. Okay, moving on. Immediately following the attack, I implemented our government's emergency response plan. Our military is powerful and is prepared. Our emergency teams are working in New York City and Washington, D.C. to help with local rescue efforts. Our first priority is to get help for those who are injured and to take every precaution to protect our citizens at home and around the world from further attacks. Okay, so until here, what do we see? So immediately following the attacks, he implemented the government's emergency plan. So we're prepared, basically, right? Our military is powerful and is prepared. So it's reassuring people that we might be attacked today. Even though we're attacked today, we're not weak, right? America has long been said to have the world's, I mean, it's true, they have the world's strongest military. And basically what Bush is saying is, yeah, we're attacked, but we're also like, they messed up, basically. We are prepared, they messed up, right? However, instead of focusing on what we're going, like what the government, I guess, and what the military is gonna do to the terrorist organization, he instead segues that off to people, right? Our emergency teams are working in, the affected cities to help with rescue efforts. And the first priority is not revenge. The first priority is get help, right? It's to help those who are injured and to take precaution to stop the world from further attacks. So when America is attacked, they don't focus on, retribution. Like, let's say today you're hit with a punch. So let's say today your friend got hit by something. You're not focusing on hitting that person who hit your friend. And so what you're focusing on is making sure your friend is first okay before taking any further action, right? And that paints more of a compassionate picture. The functions of our government continue without interruption. Federal agencies in Washington, which had to be evacuated today, are reopening for essential personnel tonight and will be open for business tomorrow. Now, this is important, right? Instead of saying he says basically we'll continue without interruption. Yeah, he gives specific detail. So, for example, the federal agencies in Washington, D.C., they have to be evacuated today because of the terrorist attack, right? So they had to move basically all the important people out of office. However, what he's saying is he's reassuring the people that we're all going back to work tonight to help with the situation. So although we have to evacuate these important buildings, America is still running. Like, it's still business as usual, right? We're not fundamentally, we are not affected basically by the attack. our financial institution remains strong, and the American economy will be open for business as well. So yeah, despite these attacks, we're still who we are. The search is underway for those who are behind these acts. I've directed the full resource of our intelligence and law enforcement communities to find those responsible and bring them to justice. We will make no distinction between the terrorists who commit these acts and those who harbored them. So here, then after he finishes talking about like the rescue efforts and the domestic plans for the country, then he transitions basically into what America would do, right? Like what the America ought to do to basically act as retribution. Okay. I appreciate so very much the members of Congress have joined me in condemning these attacks. On behalf of the American people, he thanks the many world leaders who offered their condolences. America and our friends and allies will join with all those who want peace and security in the world and will stand together to win the war against terrorism. Now he goes on to the international scale, right? So notice he goes from local efforts here to national efforts to basically help everyone, to national efforts to identify the terrorists, to global support, right? So it goes from a small scale to a big scale to show that basically we were covered from all the fronts. So from the local attacks, the attacks that happen locally, we're dealing with that. The national agencies, and then basically the national engine, you can say, the political and the economic of the country, the national engine, it's still running well. And lastly, the international efforts to resolve this is also going smoothly as well. Right. And tonight, I ask of your prayers for all those who grieve, for the children whose worlds have been shattered, for whose safety and security has been threatened. So here, once we can see, he asks for prayer, which is normal, right? However, the specific words, I guess, that are interesting that raise my attention here is for the children whose worlds have been shattered, right? This is like kind of an interesting word to say, because instead of just saying, imagine the sentence without this line. It feels suddenly a bit weaker, right? Instead of just saying, I ask for prayers for all those who grieve, he mentioned for children whose world have been shattered, and for all those whose sense of security and safety has been threatened. This kind of brings out like he doesn't say that we're vulnerable, but he paints the situation in the perspective of those who are vulnerable and asks the strong people to stand up, to ask the adults basically to stand up, right? So children innately fosters a sense of vulnerability, like they're helpless, basically. They don't even know what's happening, and suddenly their country, who they thought has been invincible and strong, have been safe, has suddenly been shattered, right? Imagine if your country is suddenly attacked today, you suddenly like feel a little bit unsettled as to your sense of future, right? So he's bringing that feeling inside, and he's asking people to pray together for a stronger America, right? So he'll pray they'll be comforted by a power greater than us. And he brings out a quote basically from the Bible, which most people should know. At least most people in America should know. I don't know because I'm not Christian, but most people should know. Okay, now here, last sentence. This is a day where all Americans from every walk of life unite in our resolve for justice and peace. America has stood down enemies before, and we will do so. We will do so this time. None of us will ever forget this day. Yet we will go forward to defend the freedom and all that is good and just in our world. Like a quick summary, basically, of the speech, and to really emphasize the attitudes that he wants to leave the readers with. Right? So that's kind of me analyzing the entire speech and talking about like the rhetoric and the choices behind what he did. Now, for example, for rhetorical choices, one thing that I saw repeat over and over again which is common, right, by the way, right? But one thing that he used is we, us, right? The collective pronoun. I call it the collective pronoun. We, us, our. He uses that throughout the speech, which of course makes sense because he's talking to the American public, right? It makes sense. However, it still has an overall rhetorical impact on the speech. So yeah, he uses I basically to talk about like what he has done. But for most part, he talks about the country in us and our, right? So for example, instead of saying our financial institution remains strong, he could have said like I made sure these things are okay. I made sure the banks are open. I made sure the military is ready. But instead of saying like I made sure or like I ensured or I basically carried out these acts to make sure the country is okay, he characterizes it in our. So our military is powerful, right? Our priority is to get help. Instead of saying like, oh, I've called the rescue efforts, he said our priority is to get help. So he doesn't use I that often. Instead, he uses our a lot. So one of these choices I'll definitely write down is the collective pronoun, right? Collective pronoun of we, us, our. Okay. Does anyone can anyone think of another choice basically that George W. Bush uses in the speech? You guys can view it on yours. You don't have to view it from my screen. You guys can view it from your screen as well. That's in Crystal. What's one like rhetorical choice that you think he uses? If you're really, by the way, if you guys are really not sure, like it's okay as well. Okay? Okay, it's okay. So one thing that I think I mentioned, sorry, I mentioned was the physical and like what's the juxtaposition that happened in this paragraph, right? So our nation saw evil, the very worst, and we responded with the best, like the juxtaposition between the worst and the best, right? Similarly, the foundations, the physical foundations are shaken, but the foundation of American resolve, I guess, stays the same. Same thing, the physical buildings are shattered, yet the American resolve, the steel of American resolve stays the same. So there's definitely this juxtaposition here. Position, right? Juxtaposition between what happened vs the response, right? That's one rhetorical choice I can point out. Another one is another like I guess another example that I can bring out would be another choice would be like I think. And okay, yeah, I'll ask you guys first. Any other choices? Because I feel like the more I say it, the less you guys can identify. So any other ideas for you guys?
Like he uses pretty strong words.
Yeah, exactly. Perfect. Right. Exactly. That's the one I don't want to say. Yeah, but that's actually correct. Exactly correct. So diction, right? We call it diction / specific word choice. So strong words, of course, that we mentioned are words like evil, despicable, murder, right? However, I want to ask you this question, Sean. Do you think the words, do you think there's an evolution of words basically? Like he starts off the speech definitely with strong words, right? Like murder, deadly and deliberate. But do you think he ends the speech with really strong words or no?
No, because in the end, like he sends like prayer, and this prayer like seems to be like pretty, soft.
Soft, yeah, exactly. So he starts the speech with really strong and like negative words like anger, deliberate, deadly. Yeah, he ends the speech with a much softer approach, right? So this is exactly what I want, like you guys, which is very good that you guys noticed this. This is what we call a shift in tone, right? So tone is just basically how I talk. So I can say, I can sound angry, I can like yell at you, but I can also be nice to you, right? That's a difference in tone. So definitely there seems to be a difference and we can identify tone. Of course, the easiest way to hear tone is to listen to the speech, right? As I say, I play the speech out. I want to hear what he's saying and if it changes. Another way that we can do this is by looking at specific diction, right? Diction is a good way to indicate tone. But Let me blow my nose. Give me 1 second. Oh, sorry about that. Diction is a really good way to indicate tone. And like Sean has said, he starts the speech off with strong words. Yeah, he ends the speech with much more mild and I would say like caring words, like nicer words, right? You know, the good, none of us will ever forget this day. He doesn't say none of us will ever forget this evil day, right? Instead of focusing on the acts that happened to them, what did he do? He says he focuses on the freedom and the good and just in the world, right? Instead of focusing on the negative, he focuses on the positive. Another thing that we noticed is in the very beginning, you see how he talked about pictures of planes flying into buildings. This like imagery, this like gruesome imagery of what had happened, right? Yet at the end, he talks about America has stood down enemies before and will do so the same. He doesn't talk about the attack again. He mentioned it once. He mentioned that exactly what happened once, and he doesn't talk about it again. And why? Why do you guys think that's the case? Any ideas behind it? Well, at least, okay, like for me at least, let me put it back into the friend got a bad grade on a test exam. Okay, of course, the two issues are not the same, right? They're not remotely the same. But I say today, I'm trying to comfort a friend who failed a test and feels bad. I might say, like what Serena mentioned earlier, I might say, yeah, no, it's only one test out of many, you're gonna be fine, right? But in doing so, what did I do? I mentioned the test again. I mentioned my friend doing bad on the test again, right? So I said today, I talked to them for 3 hours. I'm like, yeah, I know you really messed up this test. Like you really messed it up. Like, I don't know how you messed it up, but you really messed it up. If I just re-emphasize that over and over again, it's undoubtedly gonna feel bad. At some point, it feels like, it could even feel like I'm making fun of a friend, right? However, what if I do this? What if I initially say, I just get what needed to be said out of the way first. So I say stuff like, yeah, I know you failed the test and you might blame yourself, and to some extent it is partially your fault, right? But it's okay, because what we're going to do from here is I'm going to study with you, right? Assuring that the country is prepared. So I'm going to study with you in the future. We're going to have this academic plan all planned out. And at the very end, why don't we go out for ice cream, right? To forget about this. So you have the focus on the issue, but gradually drag away from the issue. You drag away from focusing on the issue specifically and in detail to a more abstract what we should do to resolve this issue, to then just something to ease our conscience, right? So that's very much the evolution of the speech as well. You have the mentioning of the topic in specific detail and a lot of negativity, frankly, right? To the solutions that they have installed on the local, national, and international scale. And lastly, to just prayer, because what can you do other than prayer at this point, right? To something to ease the conscience of the people. So there's an evolution of that and also an evolution in tone. So I might move down here, I might say tone. So there's an evolution in tone. What's the evolution in tone we might say then? It might go from like a really like serious, right? Serious, angry, you can even say angry, right? Because, you know, he even, like George W. Bush even concedes there is an unyielding anger in American people. You know, they're annoyed, they're like vexed. They're just mad about this thing happening, right? However, you go from anger, you go from all that negativity. I guess you can say like negative, right? Definitely negative. You go from all that to what is the tone at the end? A sense of hopefulness, right? Positivity, looking forward to the future. So there's definitely a shift in tone, positivity, right? Like hopefulness. Right? So there's definitely a shift in tone in that respect. Okay. Okay. Now appeals. Crystal, what do you think the appeals in this speech are? I'd say today when I went over the slides, I talked about ethos, logos, and pathos. Ethos being credibility, logos being evidence, and pathos being emotion, what aspect do you think, or which part do you think the speech falls under?
I don't know. I think he used like some logos by like saying how strong the United States is. Like
Okay, like
he's
logos.
kind of saying like we're like really strong and like everyone can kind of like help.
Mhm. Okay, so logos is one. Yeah, how strong the US
And-
is.
Yeah,
And then he also proves that later, right? So
yeah.
he
He
says,
uses ethos too.
okay, ethos. And what do you think the ethos is?
Like he said that they have like strong like militaries and
Yeah, and of course, he's the president. Ethos is about credibility. So why should I believe the speaker, right? So, for example, it could be used in two ways. Let's say today I am, okay, how about this? Let's say, okay, so you guys are in this class. I think maybe because your parents told you to, right? But also because like I'm a college student, so I kind of like already learned a lot of these things before, right? But let's say today I'm a fifth grader, and suddenly my words maybe don't mean as much, right? Let's say like we fast forward an hour ago, and I say, "Hi guys, I'm Anngu. I'm a fifth grader." Yeah, suddenly you guys might not be so inclined to listen to me because my ethos, my credibility has dropped, right? So ethos could be used in two ways. Ethos could be used, the first way, of course, is to cite someone. So I can say, oh, this university professor said this, the Harvard or the Columbia, like, journal said this, whatever. That's ethos. However, another ethos is just innately the speaker. The speaker has to carry some credibility, right? So, yeah, Crystal, which one were you talking about? I just wanted to clarify that real quickly. But which ethos are you talking about?
Wait. I don't know. I think I was trying to go for like kind of like a both way.
So yeah, for ethos at least you mentioned like the military, right? So I think
Yeah.
George W. Bush mentions the military as strong. Now that is only credible. You only feel reassured by that because he's the president, right? Because he's literally the head of the military, right? I mean, if you guys learned the U.S. government before, you guys have learned that. You guys learned the legislative, executive, and judicial branch, right? Or no? It's okay if you guys haven't too. That's just random like knowledge. But if you guys learned that anyway, you'll know the president is the head of the executive branch, and the head of the executive branch is in charge of the military. So of course you'll know about the military, right? So there's ethos. You can say like, for example, military is strong, is only reassuring because he is the president. Because Bush is the president, right? Definitely there's ethos here. What about Eva? What do you think there's any like pathos?
I think he uses. Wait, let me check the passage. I think when he says, huge structure collapsing has filled us with disbelief, terrible sadness, and a quiet, unyielding anger is like pathos. Because like, and then later he says to stay like our country is strong. So like I think he uses pathos to like convince us to say like, oh, we're strong, like we can do this.
Yeah, so definitely. So then there's definitely pathos here, right? Like a speech can have all three, by the way. When have you made an argument that only relies on one, right? If I make a solely like logical argument, it feels boring. If I make an ethos-centric argument, it lacks stakes and it lacks like logic, right? I'm just citing other people. And if I only use pathos, it feels manipulative, right? So each one of these things have their own advantages, yet have their own weaknesses. So there's definitely a lot of pathos throughout the essay. You can see this by like just the specific diction that he uses, right? And together you need all three to build a comprehensive essay, but you want to identify which choice ties to what. So definitely here I can mention like word choices such as like disbelief, disbelief, stuff like that. Okay, so here, so now we have filled in everything here. Now the purpose of, or how we write a rhetorical analysis is quite simple, honestly. You guys all know what a thesis is, right? Or are you guys not sure? A thesis statement. Do you guys know what a thesis statement is?
Isn't it like the main idea or something?
Yeah, the main idea, right? So the main idea of the essay. So we had to write a thesis statement and we had to identify how, like to write the essay. So now that we have everything here, remember, let's go back to rhetorical analysis. Let's read it. Right? Rhetorical analysis is when we apply our critical thinking to the entirety of the text, breaking it down to the sum of its parts. And that's kind of what I just did, right? When I went through the entire speech, that's kind of what I just did. And then determine what the writer is trying to achieve and what strategies they're doing to accomplish their purpose. So you guys are correct in their purpose, right? They settle people down to call to action to stay united and also telling the terrorists that they have failed. These are some of the purpose that George W. Bush has. Now, how does each one of these choices, appeals, and tone contribute to each one of these purpose? So let's say today, I pull this down. Actually, give me 1 second. Let me do this real quick. Sorry about this. Give me just a moment. Okay. So there. Go. Okay. So let's say today we do it like this. Okay. We list out everything that we mentioned, we saw here, and we say, let me do this. Okay. Let's say today we pull everything from here out. So we pull this out, and we pull these three out, right? So here now we have choices, appeals, and tone, and we have purpose at the bottom. Okay? Let's say that we do this, and we said, okay, for choices, we say pronoun usage, repetition, word choice. And for appeals, we say pathos. But we can also put down, let's say we also put down what we mentioned here, which is, there's definitely logos and ethos here as well. So put that down, right? And we also have tone, which is, we said motivational, anger to determine, right? And we have all of these purpose that we mentioned here, which is to give people a sense of comfort, focus on strength of America, reassurance and optimism, unity and belonging, and of course, kind of like a threat to terrorists, right? Now we have everything here. We just have to tie it together, weave it together into an essay. So, for example, the thesis statement, let's just say we want to focus on let's say today we have these three things, right? We have the choices, we have everything here. I just say we pick a few and make a thesis statement. So, for example, an easy two-part thesis might be through the usage of the collective pronoun and a shift in tone. George W. Bush reassures the general public that despite what happened to the United States on 9/11, the country and its people will stay strong. So easy, right? So what I did was I mentioned one here. This is collective pronoun. Right? So this is what we call choice one, right? And then we can say a shift in tone. So this is a rhetorical, when I say choice, I mean rhetorical choice. Rhetorical choice two, right? Bush reassures the general public that despite what happened to the US on 9/11, the country and people will stay strong. What is this? This is the purpose, right? So you see how by doing this, I tie everything together. So I do exactly what the rhetorical analysis wants me to do. I analyze the rhetorical choices of author, and I tie it behind a purpose. Right, so that's kind of what we want to do. That's going to be your assignment basically for next week. Right. So then that's for example, this is my thesis, right? My thesis is this. So based looking at all the I guess you can say straps, all the analytical bits that we have here, what are some other theses that you guys could come up with? Anyone want to take on this challenge? I'm not gonna call people because this is hard. So I'm not gonna call on people to do this. But if anyone want to volunteer, feel free to. Does anyone have like any ideas they have in mind? So it could be a little bit repetitive, right? When it comes to the purpose that I've listed like really specific purposes here, but it could be a bit repetitive. So, but still it's fine even if it's a little bit repetitive, right? So for example, one thing that I might mention is the word choice, right? The word choice, and let's say today, I take the word choice and I take pathos, okay? So I basically mentioned how the word choice achieves pathos and how he's using the pathos to do whatever. So you can say, for example, in his speech, right? George W. Bush uses specific, we can say like strong word choices and methodic languages to, is that not a word? Not pathetic, okay, never mind. Like we can say emotional appeals, right? Because pathos is basically just an emotional appeal. So emotional appeals. And what does he use these two things for? To characterize the evil that has been done to the United States. Yeah, also reassure. Yeah, also we can say just directly copy what's up here. Address the situation. Or actually no, yeah. And to give people a sense of comfort. How about that? That's a bit better than the bottom one. So that's also another thesis statement that's along the same vein, but using different rhetorical choices / appeals / tone, right? And the first one I mentioned a choice, a rhetorical choice and a tone. And the second one I mentioned a choice and an appeal, and with no mention of tone, right? So the more you can identify, of course, the more option you have, and the more flexibility you have. But it's not mandated to have it. Okay? So with the thesis statement done, now we want to talk about the body paragraph. So how you actually write out the essay, right? So there's a lot of, you write this out like essays that, like normal essays that you write out. But I'll just like give you an example. 1 second. Okay, so let me see. Okay, so I said today we want to write about. I said today our thesis statement is about, instead of saying a shift in tone, I can just mention. Let's say we join these together. Okay. So for example, I write through. I'll just copy this. Through the usage of a collective pronoun, and I add one more. I write specific word choices and a shift in tone. I use all three. I use the three that I feel the most confident in. Okay. George W. Bush reassures the public that despite what happens to the United States on 9/11, the country and its people will stay strong. Let's say this is my thesis statement. Then I have to separate this out into body paragraphs, right? So what's my first body paragraph about? My first body paragraph will be about one rhetorical choice. So about, for example, the collective pronoun. So you can say body 1. And what's the second body paragraph? Body 2 would be about specific word choice. And lastly, body 3 would be about shift. Now, I'll talk about all of these three things. Yet, basically, thesis is the main idea of my essay. So everything has to tie back to the thesis. So in this case, I can't just talk about the collective pronoun by talking about the collective pronoun. I need to talk about the collective pronoun in context of this, right? Of what I mentioned, of the purpose of what I mentioned down here. So for example, I need to mention, not for example, like just to explain, I need to explain how the collective pronoun reassures the general public about all of this thing. So for example, I can say something like by repeating, right? By repeating the collective pronouns of we, us, and our. Let's put this. We, us, and our. Right? George W. Bush, right? Ushers a sense of unity and security among, you can say, among the in-group, right? In-group. Something like this, right? And then I need to, and then if I mention this, then I need to find a specific textual evidence that supports this point. For example, we're gonna say, you can say like from the very, from like, so here you can say from the very first line of the speech, right? Bush mentions, and what does he mention? In the very first line of his speech, he talks about our way of life, our freedom, our way of life, our fellow citizens, our freedom, right? So, already utilizes the collective pronoun, right? So I can't type today. I think it's because it's early in the morning. It's annoying. Okay, so for example, then I copy this here, right? Here. So then in the very first line of the speech, Bush already utilizes the collective pronoun, and I give the example. So basically I talk about what he does, and then I mention what he does, and I give an example of what he does. Now I need to do what I call commentary. So everything up here is evidence, right? So I'm telling you something, I'm illustrating that this thing exists, right? Now I need to explain the implications of this. It's like finding a dinosaur bone and be like, okay, so evidence is I have a bunch of fossils here. Now, what does this imply? Well, this implies that there are animals before humans that existed on the earth, right? Similarly here, I want to talk about how the collective pronoun, and specifically this example, does what I want, right? So for example, from very first line of the speech, Bush already utilizes the collective pronoun, right? This pulls the American people together. We can say this pulls his intended audience, the American people, behind a common banner and illustrates how the entire country was affected by the terrorist attack. Of course, I'm not writing this well. I'm being still a little bit too vague, but this is kind of what you want to do, okay? And then if you can find another example of the collective pronoun being at work, you can say stuff like, you can say, for example, here, the usage of collective pronouns when it comes to thanking the international communities here, right? Oh, wait, here. So so America and our friends, right? So there's definitely, some essence of community here. Another example that you might want to do is, let me just find it really quickly. One sec. Is specific word, like I say today, then we move on to the second paragraph, which is the specific word choice. So if we do talk about specific word choice, we'll do similarly what we did with this first step, right? But instead of talking about collective pronoun, we talk about specific word choice. So we find the instance of word choice. A really easy like topic selection. Bush also utilizes, or you can say employs, strong and specific word choice to service his purpose. I guess it's kind of weird to say, but you can say to fulfill his purpose. His purpose of comforting the American people. We can say, is that comforting the American people? We can say, because we mentioned, notice how our thesis statement is despite what happened to the United States on 9/11. We can say to fulfill the purpose of denouncing the terrorist attack while comforting the American people. So what are some examples of this? Well, we already mentioned it earlier, but for example, you can mention how, that's right, okay. So for example, you can mention the mass murder, right? You can mention the disbelief. You can mention deadly and deliberate and deadly terrorist attack. These are examples of what? Of specific word choices that really kind of denounces the terrorist attack that happens. So for example, we can say, let's just say I wrote down all these examples, deliberate and deadly, because we're almost out of time, that's kind of my bad. But if we mention all of these things, then we can, and what's an example of common? Let me just write it out, okay? So for example, Bush uses words such as deliberate and deadly, right? Mass murder, and okay, so deliberate and deadly and mass murder to characterize the terrorist attacks, right? Now, for example, you can say these choices, and then I have to explain why these words are effective. So these words are especially effective because of their negative connotation. Now I have to explain, right? So deliberate and deadly according to definition, means it's on purpose, right? Whereas for mass murder, it implies a sense of almost hopelessness against what is going to happen. And now all of these paints the picture that America is a victim in this situation, and that there ought to be things done basically to the terrorists who brought such harm to its people. So that will be, so for example, here is the topic sentence. Now I have evidence. And lastly, I want to have what we call this commentary to explain to you why it's like this. Okay? So that's kind of the steps of writing a rhetorical analysis. You first read the speech, of course, like we did, and then you have this basically you guys don't have to use this. I'll send you guys this template anyway. You have this rhetorical situation, or what we call space cat organizer. You want to identify everything that's here, right? And then with all the pieces that you've gathered up, then you want to put them together into a coherent thesis statement, like this one, for example, with body paragraphs that have a topic sentence, evidence, and commentary. And you want to do that for how many choices you want, right? So for homework, I will send you guys an essay called The Digital Trap. I want you guys to do